The room was still except for the sound of my baby's soft cries, which broke the silence like a fragile thread. Before I could react, I felt a sharp tug on my hair. My head snapped back, and pain seared across my cheek as Jackson's hand collided with my face. Tears welled up instantly, blurring my vision as I struggled to stay upright, clutching my son tightly to my chest. "This is for your own good, Emma," Jackson growled, his voice devoid of empathy. My heart pounded wildly, a storm of fear and disbelief surging through me. How had my life unraveled so quickly? "Hi, my name is Jasmine. I'm 30 years old, and just a few months ago, I became a mother for the first time. It's been a whirlwind, both exhilarating and exhausting. Those first precious days at home with my baby boy were filled with joy, but also sleepless nights and constant chaos. I had prepared myself for the physical recovery after childbirth, but I hadn't anticipated the sheer magnitude of the challenges that came with it. The house was always in disarray. Laundry piled up, dishes sat in the sink longer than they should have, and my to-do list only grew. Every waking moment was devoted to my son, leaving little room for anything else. Still, I gave it my all. But no matter how hard I tried, it never felt like enough, not for Jackson, and especially not for his mother, Matilda. One afternoon, as I was soothing my crying baby, the doorbell rang unexpectedly. I opened the door to find Matilda standing there, her sharp gaze immediately taking in the cluttered living room. Toys were scattered across the floor, and the remnants of an unfinished lunch sat on the coffee table. I could see the judgment in her eyes. "I thought I'd check in," Matilda said, stepping over a toy without waiting for an invitation. "Jackson mentioned you might need some help." "Thank you, Matilda," I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. "Things are a bit hectic, but we're managing." Her eyes swept over the room once more, her lips pressing into a thin line. "This place is a mess," she said bluntly. "Is this how you plan to raise my grandson?" Her words stung. I felt a lump rise in my throat but forced myself to stay composed. "I'm doing the best I can," I said softly, holding my baby closer. "Your best doesn't seem good enough," she shot back. "Being a mother means prioritizing. Clearly, you're struggling with that." Before I could respond, Jackson walked into the room, his expression shifting as he sensed the tension. "Mom, Jasmine's doing her best. It's been tough, especially with the baby not sleeping well." Instead of softening, Matilda's tone grew sharper. "She needs to learn discipline, Jackson. You can't coddle her. She'll only get better if she's held accountable." I looked at Jackson, hoping he would stand up for me. But instead, he hesitated. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Maybe you're right, Mom. Maybe Jasmine does need to try harder." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at him, disbelief and hurt coursing through me. Matilda's expression hardened as she turned to Jackson, her voice low but commanding. "Show her this behavior won't be tolerated." What happened next shattered the fragile illusion of our family. Jackson grabbed my hair roughly, yanking me toward him. His hand struck my face, the sound reverberating through the room like a thunderclap. My baby's cries grew louder as I stumbled, clutching him protectively, my world spinning. In that moment, something inside me broke, but something else ignited. I knew I couldn't stay in this house, under this roof, in this nightmare. My son deserved a safe, loving environment. And I deserved to reclaim my life. That day marked the beginning of my journey to freedom. It wasn't easy, but I found strength in places I didn't know existed. Motherhood had already taught me resilience, but this fight for myself and for my son taught me courage. This rewrite sharpens the emotional intensity of your story, maintains the realism of the struggles faced, and emphasizes Jasmine's resolve to escape and rebuild. Let me know if there's anything else you'd like to adjust. "David, what are you doing?" I managed to ask through my tears. The sting from the slap paled in comparison to the pain of betrayal. My chest tightened as I searched his face for any sign of regret or compassion, but his expression was cold, unreadable. "This is for your own good, Jasmine," he said flatly, his voice devoid of emotion. He didn't even look me in the eyes. The room was eerily silent, save for the soft whimpers of our son, who clung to me tightly. My hands trembled as I held him, desperate to shield him from the chaos around us. David glanced at me briefly, his face a mix of frustration and embarrassment, but there was no apology in his eyes. Matilda, his mother, stood off to the side, her posture rigid and her expression stern. She didn't flinch or say a word, just watched as though this scene was exactly what she'd expected. Her silence was louder than any words she could have spoken. What should have been a visit to offer help had spiraled into something far more sinister. As Matilda prepared to leave, she leaned in to whisper something to David. I couldn't make out her words, but the smug look on her face and the troubled expression on his told me it wasn't anything kind. The chill in the air as she walked out the door felt suffocating, wrapping itself around me like a cold, heavy blanket. That night, after the chaos of the day, I rocked my son to sleep, his soft breaths the only thing grounding me. But I couldn't shake the fear and dread that had settled deep in my chest. The house no longer felt like a home, it felt like a prison, built by the very people who were supposed to protect and love us. I realized then that I had to leave, not just for myself, but for my son. David had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and I couldn't trust him anymore. With Matilda's influence always looming, staying meant putting both myself and my baby at risk. That night, I couldn't bear to lie next to David. Instead, I retreated to the nursery, a small room that had become my haven in recent weeks. I sat in the rocking chair, clutching my son, as the day's events replayed over and over in my mind. Each time I thought about it, the pain deepened, solidifying my resolve. I had to get out. The next morning, while David was at work and Matilda was thankfully absent, I made a call. Rosie, my closest friend, answered almost immediately. "Rosie, it's me. I need your help," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and determination. "Say no more, Jasmine. I'll bring my truck and come by this evening," she replied, her voice calm and reassuring. We devised a simple but risky plan. During the day, I would pack only the essentials, clothes, baby supplies, and anything irreplaceable. Rosie would arrive at dusk, and together we would quietly move everything out before David came home. The hours that followed were a blur of packing and anxiety. Every baby outfit and toy I placed in a box felt heavy with memories of the life I had dreamed of. I couldn't stop thinking about the family I had wanted to build with David, a family rooted in love and trust. But the sharp memory of his slap and Matilda's cold, judgmental gaze reminded me why staying was no longer an option. By late afternoon, most of my belongings were boxed up and hidden in the garage. My heart raced as I moved through the house, trying to remain calm and focused. When Rosie arrived, just as the sun began to set, it felt like a lifeline. "Are you ready?" she asked, stepping inside and surveying the boxes and bags. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, clutching my baby boy tightly to my chest. We worked quickly and silently, loading everything into her truck. Each box we carried felt like a step closer to freedom, a step further from the fear and control that had consumed my life. As we finished, I took one last look at the house. It was supposed to be a place of love, a safe haven for my family. But now, it was just a shell of broken promises and pain. "Let's go," I said, climbing into the truck with my son. Rosie nodded, her presence a source of strength as she started the engine. As we pulled away, I felt a mix of emotions, fear, sadness, and relief. It wasn't going to be easy, but I knew I was making the right choice. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one where my son and I could finally breathe freely. It wouldn't happen overnight, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hope. As Rosie and I packed up the nursery, the last room in the house, my heart ached. The nursery had been my sanctuary, a small space of peace in a home that had become a battleground. I took a final look around, whispering a silent goodbye to the life I had once dreamed of with David. That dream was over now. As we drove away, the house grew smaller in the rearview mirror, fading like a distant chapter in a book I no longer wanted to read. Though my heart felt heavy, a flicker of hope emerged. My baby slept peacefully in his car seat, unaware of the monumental change happening around him. But for the first time in a long time, I knew he was safe. That night, as I settled into Rosie's home, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Her house was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere I had just escaped. The safety and love I felt there only solidified my resolve. I would ensure that neither David nor Matilda could ever hurt us again. Leaving wasn't enough, I needed to protect myself and my son from their manipulation. I began by reaching out to friends and family, pretending I just wanted to catch up. During these conversations, I carefully steered the dialogue toward Matilda and David, subtly gathering information. Some people hesitated, unsure of how much to share, but others offered glimpses into Matilda's controlling behavior and David's disturbing willingness to follow her lead. Over time, I built a collection of evidence, saved text messages, voicemails, and recorded conversations. The most damning piece came when I managed to capture a video of Matilda coaching David on how to fix me. Her words were chilling, dripping with cold calculation. It was clear her actions weren't driven by love or concern, they were about control. With enough evidence to expose the truth, I decided to confront them during a family gathering hosted by David's sister. It was a neutral setting with plenty of relatives present, including some who had hinted at being uncomfortable with Matilda's dominance over the years. I hoped this would be the moment to reveal the full extent of her manipulation. On the day of the gathering, my nerves were on edge. My hands shook, and my heart raced, but I knew this confrontation was necessary. Rosie came with me for support, her presence a steadying force. As I entered the room, I felt the tension immediately. Conversations were muted, and everyone's eyes darted toward me. Word of David and Matilda's behavior had already started to spread, and even distant relatives had heard rumors. After the initial greetings, I took a deep breath, stood, and steadied myself. "I have something important to say," I began, my voice shaking but firm. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to me. "This is about David and his mother, Matilda. Their actions haven't just hurt me and my son, they've affected this entire family." David's face went pale. "Jasmine, don't do this here," he said, his voice urgent, but I didn't stop. "No, David," I replied, pulling out my phone. "It's time everyone knows the truth." Connecting my phone to a Bluetooth speaker, I played the recordings. Matilda's icy, authoritative voice filled the room as she instructed David on how to control me. David's hesitant yet complicit responses followed, confirming her dominance over him. The reactions were immediate. Some family members looked shocked, others disgusted. David's aunt, who had always been kind to me, turned to Matilda with tears in her eyes. "Is this true, Matilda? Were you really forcing David to do this?" Matilda's face flushed red with anger. "These are taken out of context," she snapped, her voice defensive. But it was too late. David's cousin, who had been quietly observing, stood up and spoke. "They're not out of context. We've seen signs of this for years, but we didn't want to believe it." The room erupted as family members began sharing their own stories, times when they had felt pressured or manipulated by Matilda. Piece by piece, a picture emerged of a woman who had controlled her family for years, hiding her actions under the guise of care and concern. David sat silently, his face pale and his shoulders slumped. For the first time, it seemed he fully grasped the extent of his mother's influence over his life. As the heated discussion continued, I felt an enormous weight lift off my shoulders. The truth was finally out, and it wasn't just me who saw it anymore. The family who had been under Matilda's control for so long now understood her manipulations for what they truly were. After the confrontation, the atmosphere was somber. The family struggled to come to terms with years of covert control and the damage it had caused. For me, the decision to leave David had been painful, but now, it felt vindicated. I knew this was only the beginning. My path forward wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Free to rebuild my life. Free to protect my son. And free from the fear and manipulation that had once defined my world. As the family began to leave the gathering, I held my son close. He remained blissfully unaware of the storm raging around us, his innocence a stark contrast to the chaos of the day. With one last look at the family home, I stepped into the unknown, knowing it was the right thing for us. David stood by the door, his face a mix of sadness and regret. His whispered goodbye felt distant, like the echo of a life I no longer belonged to. I didn't look back. Matilda, however, faced a harsher reality. The family she had controlled for so long now saw her for who she truly was. Her web of manipulation unraveled, leaving her isolated as relatives began to distance themselves. Her attempts to regain control went unheard. The evidence from the recordings and testimonies had been too damning to ignore. In the weeks that followed, David tried to reach out. His messages were filled with apologies, promises of change, and pleas for forgiveness. But the memory of his raised hand and Matilda's toxic influence loomed too large to forget. Trust had been shattered, and with it, our marriage. This was the end of one chapter and the start of a new one, a chapter where I would build a life free of fear and control, a life where my son could grow up in safety and love. I found a small apartment far from the neighborhood I once called home. It was a quiet space where no one knew my story, a blank canvas where I could start over without the weight of the past. Rosie stayed by my side, her unwavering support helping me navigate this new life. My days became simple yet meaningful. I poured my energy into caring for my son and slowly piecing my life back together. Healing wasn't easy, it came in small, painstaking steps. Some days the weight of the past felt unbearable, but the freedom to make my own choices kept me moving forward. Therapy became a lifeline, a place where I could untangle the emotional wounds I carried. I joined support groups for single mothers and found solace in the shared experiences of others who had faced similar struggles. Slowly, the fractured pieces of my identity began to mend. I wasn't the same person I had been before, I was stronger now, more resilient. My son's laughter became my anchor, grounding me through the toughest days. Watching him grow and reach new milestones brought immeasurable joy. As he learned to walk and talk, I rediscovered my confidence. Together, we were building a safe and loving home, one free from the shadows of manipulation. Months turned into a year. One quiet evening, after putting my son to bed, I sat alone in our cozy living room. The walls were adorned with his colorful drawings, and his toys lay scattered, a beautiful mess that spoke of the life we were creating. Sipping tea, I reflected on how far we had come. The pain of the past still lingered, but it no longer consumed me. The light of new beginnings was far brighter. That night, I made a decision. I would share my story, not just for myself, but for others who might be trapped in similar cycles of fear and control. I started a blog, a safe space where I could write about my journey. Each post became a step away from victimhood and a step closer to becoming an advocate. Through my writing, I connected with others who had faced manipulation or abuse. I wanted them to know they weren't alone. Sharing my story gave me purpose, it transformed my pain into something meaningful, a way to support and empower others. Over time, I realized I had grown into a new version of myself. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. My journey was one of resilience, of finding strength in hardship and reclaiming my voice. As I conclude this chapter of my life, I leave you with a question. Is it truly possible to fully break free from the grip of a manipulative family? Or do the effects of those relationships stay with us forever? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below.